Saturday. It's August 31st, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And we hope you have not been reading the news this week and that you have been on vacation and enjoying the last week of summer. But just in case you missed anything, here's what you need to know. Well, we've got to start the day with some Meghan Markle news. It is not enough that she is pivoting her attentions from preserves to rosé wine. More about that in the issue this week. We have also seen some new reports suggesting that she is doing some writing as well. I mean, Michael, honestly, we've already read Spare, we've watched the Netflix series, we've seen the Oprah interview, and we've listened to the podcasts. Is there really anything more left to say about her experiences with the royal family? Time and the pages shall tell. Meanwhile, we're continuing to follow the case of the sunk super yacht that took the life of British tech tycoon Mike Lynch, along with 6 others. The captain of the ship is now under investigation for manslaughter, and experts are baffled by the fact that the boat was reported to have sank during a storm in just 60 seconds. Expect more investigations among other members of the crew. But as usual, Michael, airmail is your antidote to all of that news.
Absolutely. And we've got a wonderful issue and we've got some great guests this week. First, it's little more than 2 months until the presidential election. And this past week, someone dropped out of the race, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And our own George Kalogerakis will join us to make sense of it all. Then, a man who always makes great sense of it all is Howard Bloom. Howard, as avid listeners of Morning Meeting know, has been doing fantastic work here, covering the story of the tragic murders of 4 students in Idaho. Howard's going to join us to share new insights into the case against the accused killer that he has uncovered in his latest reporting. And finally, many of you know the designer India Hicks. For years, she has shared anecdotes about her mother, Lady Pamela Hicks, and now she's written a dazzling book about her mother's extraordinary life. Everything from the bridesmaid and lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth, daughter of Earl Mountbatten, and the wife of interior designer David Hicks, and much more. It's an amazing life and a great book, and India will share all of it. So, Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
Michael, I feel like you're teasing me. I really do want to start with India Hicks to talk to her about her incredible new book. But first, we do need to get to the news. Why don't we get George Kalogerakis on here to explain the rise and fall of RFK Jr. George is a writer at large for Airmail. He handles our AWI index every week. That stands for Attention Whore Index, for those of you who are aficionados and voters. And we absolutely love him. Welcome, George.
Nice to be here.
So George is the editor of our Attention Whore Index. You have cast your attentions on RFK Jr. for quite some time. It's obviously been a big week for him in the news. Take us through it.
Well, the big news is that he suspended his campaign, and it was just announced, of course, that he's going to be part of Trump's hypothetical transition team. And what we've done, we've paid a lot of attention to him in the Attention Whore Index, but we've also done this thing where we encapsulate his entire campaign in one sentence, which is this little thing we've been doing a few times to do with Rupert Murdoch's wives and with Kimberly Guilfoyle a week or 2 ago. What can I say? I mean, the politics aside, there is this sort of running theme of strangeness to his campaign, and anyone who's looking at the papers knows what I'm talking about, as do you guys. I mean, dead bear cubs and pet ravens and lots of animal-related things and conspiracy theories and so forth. So we try to pack it all into one sentence, and the art department does an amazing job visualizing the connections among all these people and things.
I forgot that he was somewhat of a ladies' man. I mean, I knew this at the time, but please take us back through his affairs and his sex diary, because that's a tidbit that must not be lost to the ages.
Right. That came up a number of years ago. I guess it was after his second marriage and his second wife's suicide. And I guess he kept a diary of his conquests and coded it. The number 10 apparently equaled intercourse. He's spoken about, a kind of a sex addiction that he considered his major flaw. I seem to remember seeing pieces about that.
Wait, George, so it wasn't spreading huge amounts of misinformation about COVID?
He was doing that. He likened the Centers for Disease Control to Nazi Germany. He had a really unfortunate line about Anne Frank at least being able to hide in her attic, whereas, anyone forced to get vaccinated didn't have that opportunity. Of course, more recently, a lot of the themes have been, as I said, animal related. This thing about the whale. If you come across a dead whale on a beach, you'll have the reaction you have. In his case, it was to go get a chainsaw and cut the head off. So it's an unusual take, and then strap it to the roof of the car and take it home. But not everyone would do that. So certainly there's a certain amount of eccentricity, I would say.
That was shared by someone else who's also in the news this week. That was shared by his daughter, Kik, right?
Right. In a magazine article, probably 10 or 12 years ago, I think. And it just came out because, as these things do, when someone is in the news, it's all there. And you can find the stuff in the past. And, you sort of wonder, like, there's probably more. What's going to come out next? Also, he's going to be out there shilling for Trump. So presumably he'll be providing more raw material as well.
So what's the allure here for Trump, George? I mean, because to me, these two personalities in many ways seem like they're cut from the same cloth. And in others, seems like they would be inherently at odds with one another.
Yeah. Trump, as everyone knows, is very susceptible to flattery. So probably there was a certain amount of sucking up, one would imagine, which he responds to. I would guess maybe the Kennedy name, even though he's essentially been politically disowned by much of his family. He's still a Kennedy, and to Trump, that probably means something. Trump seems to crave legitimacy, and that bestows some of that on him, I suppose, in his eyes. I can't imagine at this point, he probably needs all the votes he can get. I can't imagine, from what the polls are saying, that RFK dropping out, suspending, I should say, will give Trump a lot of votes. So I don't know if it's that, but probably those other things. And then who knows what deal they might or might not have made. But it's like a brotherhood of the aggrieved, the two of them.
I'm so sorry. I'm just not done talking about his love life, because I'm now incapable of watching Curb Your Enthusiasm without thinking about the fact that Cheryl Hines, who stars as Larry David's wife, or Larry David's ex-wife, is now married to this guy.
Yeah. I mean, who knows what goes on in a marriage. She distanced herself when he said that thing about Anne Frank. She was appalled and said so publicly. Although I just saw recently that when the campaign was suspended, she posted a note, I believe, sort of thanking his team and talking about what great accomplishments they'd made and all that. So, but what are you going to do? When you're married to someone like that, presumably they have whatever relationship they have. And, it must be tricky when any couple that perhaps doesn't agree politically is facing certain hurdles that, maybe the rest of us don't face. So who knows? It's got to be awkward in Hollywood, mostly liberal, but yeah.
Well, speaking of Hollywood, I also love that, again, is like that weird degrees of separation, which is Kik, his daughter, is, if you read between the lines of certain tabloids these days, might be the reason for Ben Affleck and J-Lo for separating. So then you've got his daughter linked to Ben Affleck and J-Lo. And so I feel like the crazy summer is just going to give us a little more of these strange occurrences.
Yes, I know. I mean, it's fun that all roads seem to lead to Ben Affleck, and there are other people like that, I guess. So it was sort of fun in trying to encapsulate the whole campaign in one sentence to, lead it all to him. Of course, he has pretty much nothing to do with any of the RFK campaign, as far as we know. I suppose also when you're Robert F. Kennedy Jr., you meet a lot of people, and the degrees of separation are many and vast.
Do you think that RFK is going to help or hurt Trump's campaign, if you had to predict?
Oh, well, the polls say his dropping out is not going to make much of a difference, so that it wouldn't help or hurt Trump or Harris. So, but, the polls have not always been right. Who knows? I mean, I did see some interesting statistic not long ago that the people who were interested in Kennedy's campaign largely didn't know a lot of about the campaign in general. And it was not clear that they planned to vote for anybody. Unless I'm getting this wrong, I think one poll found that most of his supporters weren't sure that they'd vote for him, which is probably not a good sign if you're running for president. I mean, you kind of want the people who are your fans to at least go vote. It wasn't clear who they were going to vote for, whether they were going to even vote for him come November. So I can't imagine that it's going to, based on these polls anyway, going to have much of an effect.
Well, George, thanks for covering RFK Jr. so we don't have to pay too much attention to him. You're doing God's work.
Oh, thank you.
It's a masterful job, George, so thank you very much.
You're welcome, and thank you.
All right, well, in much darker matters, let's talk to Howard Bloom about the latest in the Idaho murders. Howard is a writer at large for Airmail who's been working on a book about this particular case and the saga of Brian Koberger, who's the suspect in this murder of 4 University of Idaho students in 2022. Welcome, Howard.
Nice to be back.
So, Howard, some of us have spent our summer in the sun and the sand, and you have been completely preoccupied with Idaho and the unfurling trial preparations for the case of Bryan Kohberger. Why has it taken us 2 years since the killing of these University of Idaho students to arrive at this moment?
Well, the defense's strategy has been one of delay, and more delay. They filed a rat-a-tat of motions, hoping never really to get into the courtroom to face a trial. And in the course of this, they've been able to delay things till next June. But also, in getting the discovery, they've uncovered something that could change the entire scope of the case, the history of the Bryan Kohberger case. And that's what I've written about in Airmail. It's sort of almost a sequel to the book I have out, When the Night Comes Falling, about the case.
And it's related to DNA evidence, Howard, but it's almost more than DNA evidence. So take us inside.
Yes. The big question that defense is grappling with is, when did the authorities get on to Bryan Kohberger? When did they know, and how did they know it? The information as given very briefly in the police affidavit is that they spotted a car on videos. They were able to track the car to the Washington State University campus, and Bryan Kohberger had this car. Then after he became a person of interest, after he had left for the Christmas vacation, they go into his family's home, or basically outside the home, and they steal garbage. They get the garbage, allows them to trace the DNA, and that's how they get to Bryan Kohberger. However, the defense is now discovering, and this is what I've heard from sources, that maybe this is not what happened. And this coincides also, this theory, with some of the reporting that I've done earlier in Airmail. Originally, you might recall, way back when, I said that the FBI was following Bryan Kohberger across country. The FBI denied this. Other reporters subsequently, even former FBI officials, said that indeed is what happened. And I often wondered, why was the FBI protesting this when it seemed to be confirmed by so many people? That's because the timeline was crucial to this entire case. What happened is, and this is what the defense is trying to establish now with the information they're getting from the authorities, and the authorities are fighting tooth and nail not to share this information. But this new information will establish that the prosecution is early on was able to take the DNA that was left on the knife sheath at the killing on the 3rd floor bedroom. They found a bit of touch DNA. They had this DNA processed by a lab in Texas and sent to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia. The FBI originally said they couldn't find any match. That's why they had to wait to steal the garbage. However, what the agents did, and this is what they're beginning to believe, is that the agents went into, in their zeal to find this monster who had killed these 4 young children, they had gone into websites where they weren't allowed to go. The normal genetic websites, the most popular ones like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, do not allow law enforcement authorities to go into their record. However, if they did this, if they violated these protocols on these websites, then they violated Bryan Kohberger's Fourth Amendment rights, then they violated his relatives' Fourth Amendment rights, and the entire case could be thrown out. We'd be back at square one at this point after more than 2 years.
Okay, but how likely is this scenario to happen, Howard?
It's extremely likely, and that's what makes it even more confounding. If it can be established, if they get in this discovery information that the FBI went into these websites, and that should be seen, that the prosecution is fighting tooth and nail not to share this information. But I have heard from sources close to the defense case that they are getting this information and they are prepared to make this argument very soon. This can turn this whole case upside down. It's a major event. Remember the Alec Baldwin case? The case was thrown out at the last moment because of discovery information? Well, the same thing could happen in the Bryan Kohberger case.
Okay, so Howard, let's just say that this case does get thrown out on the technicality that you've described. Is there any other recourse for the prosecution to go after Bryan Kohberger again?
I believe that they will have to start from square one, and that they're not going to let this drop. I mean, the Idaho state legislature passed a law changing the rules for the death penalty cases that if in case the chemicals necessary for a lethal injection are not available, which I found out, to my dismay, this often happens, and people just wait on death row. They are now having a firing squad in Idaho. 5 men will line up behind a wall to face the person who's been convicted of a murder case, and the Idaho authorities want this. Many members of the families go into the court hearings wearing T-shirts saying in support of Idaho Law 168, which is this firing squad provision that has just been amended to the Idaho state statutes.
It's also quite shocking when you realize, too, speculating that what was the FBI's potential motivation? It was a departmental ego. They want a big win, to take it away from the local authorities. I mean, if that proves to be true, that's quite scandalous as well.
The FBI's behavior in this case is pretty problematic. They were not working hand in hand with the local task force. They were often antagonistic. They even set up their base outside the police headquarters. They set up a separate trailer in the police parking lot, keeping themselves separate from the local task force. And why did they do this? Well, the most sympathetic explanation would be that the FBI was using new investigative technology, this genealogy, which hadn't been really established in the court of law, and they didn't want to prejudice the case. A more cynical explanation, and one that's offered by many people that I've spoken with, is the FBI wanted credit for this investigation. And during the Trump years, their reputation was assailed. They wanted to make the case that they were once again the top law enforcement agency in the nation, if not the world, and they could get the killer in this case. In their zeal to get this monster, they might have played fast and loose with some of the rules that were necessary for protecting genetic information.
Howard, you've written the book on this. You've been covering this case for 2 years. You might not answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think he did it?
Do I think Bryan Kohberger did it? Without a doubt. I make the case in great detail, in my book. You can impugn various pieces of the information. You can find experts who say that the cell phone data it's inaccurate, it's too imprecise. You can say that this is just touch DNA that was found on the knife sheath, and that's not the same as blood DNA. But ultimately, all these pieces come together. And the most compelling piece is after Bryan Kohberger is arrested, they take a DNA swab from his cheek, and this DNA swab on his cheek matches the touch DNA on the knife sheath. All these pieces coming together defy coincidence. And then you look at how the defense is responding to all this. Well, they wait a year and a half while their client is in jail, sitting in a cell in Moscow. And then they finally come up with this sort of very specious excuse that he was out staring at the stars at 4 a.m. I know if I was a lawyer and I had a client that I thought he was innocent, I would move heaven and earth to get him out of the jail right away. I wouldn't wait a year and a half to share the alibi. And I want the authorities to be looking for the person or persons who really were responsible for these 4 murders.
Well, Howard, thank you so much. I mean, fascinating story. And the way that you tell it, it's just like watching a film as we read your piece. So thank you so much for joining us and explaining this, and also for covering it in such incredible detail.
Well, thank you for having me again, and I appreciate the kind words.
Thanks, Howard.
All right. Well, Michael, okay. Let's take us out of reality and put us back into the realm of fantasy. Lady Pamela Hicks led an incredibly storied life, as her daughter India Hicks is here to tell us in a fascinating and illuminating new book about the life and times of one of England's most fascinating personalities and top talents. Welcome, India.
Thank you for having me.
So, India, before we get started about the contents of your spectacular new book, how is your mother doing? She's 95, is that right?
She's 95 and luckily was blessed with a very acute sense of humor and is extremely funny herself and a brilliant raconteur with impeccable timing. So when I'm with her in England and I go in each morning and I say, "Still alive?" She goes, "Yep, still alive."
How does she feel about this new book coming out that's going to expose her in all of her glory and fabulousness?
She said, "Darling, do you have to do it now? Can't you wait till I'm dead?" And I said, "No, because the whole fun is for you to see. It's like sort of missing your own funeral. It's kind of wonderful to see the reaction." And there has been a marvelous reaction. When it's interesting when I think about her life and kind of what it stands for, and this comes into the kind of the deeper side of the book, because obviously it's what I hope is a very beautiful, illustrated biography, and I wanted to do it like that for certain reasons. But actually, on the surface, of course, it's a very unique, very extraordinary, very privileged life. But there have been some very tragic, very difficult episodes to my mother's life. And I think that there are lessons that we, certainly my generation, can learn, and certainly the snowflake generation can learn from that. But really, she's all about it not being about her. And she feels that we have all, as a society, as a world, have become about me, me, me. And she was not brought up like that at all. So to have a book that is all about her goes against everything that she's about. So I understand why she feels a little hesitant to have a book about her.
So tell us, I mean, I think it's a very astute insight, and yet not surprising when you remember that she was of the generation of the late Queen Elizabeth and, very much it's not me, it's we kind of mentality. So for those who, we said a little bit in the intro about, your mother's place in the 20th century and now in the 21st century, but Elizabeth's maid of honor, a lady in waiting, and then sort of daughter of Mountbatten. But tell us, when you think about her, as you said, that position she had of privilege and a seat in history, what do you see of her and those qualities, and what are the qualities that she thinks should resonate more with people now?
I think that there are two words that we sort of see framing her life, which I think were learnt from her parents and then very much seen in the years that she was with the Queen, and that is about duty and service. And my mother says these are words that we no longer hear. We really don't. And I think despite her privileged background, her parents never allowed her to swan around. She was made to work from the age of 17 onwards. She went out to India with her parents when they were appointed last Viceroy and Viceroy of India. And she landed in a country that was on the verge of civil war. And she was very quickly made to work, where all of her counterparts in England, of course, were far from being expected to work. And she continued this for right up until she was married. And because they didn't have the need for the money when she was growing up, she was asked to simply work for the cause of it. She was even made to pay her parents rent when she lived in their homes. And I think that actually that made her stand apart from many others of her generation and her upbringing. And again, for me, always I've been brought up with the idea of, to whom much is given, much is expected. And we certainly we knew from an early age that we had this extraordinary life and we were very privileged and lucky, but we were expected to give back. It's sometimes when you hear that, it sounds a little bit righteous and pious, and it's not. And my mother's neither of those. She can be terribly irreverent and, as I said, very, very funny. She has a very acute observation of life. So she's great fun to be around. So I don't want it to sound like, she's this terribly serious character. She's not at all.
India, we have to know, how did she end up as a lady in waiting to Queen Elizabeth? And what exactly, we're Americans here, what exactly does that job entail, or that role?
Well, again, I think it's changing now. And our present Queen, Camilla, she's already changed the word from lady in waiting to companions. Already it's being modernized, which it needs to do. Monarchy needs to modernize itself. But I think when my mother was invited to be a lady in waiting, the world was a very different place. And at that time, royalty was still, there were celebrities. Everybody was focused on what the royal family was doing. And as we know, the Queen she served her country in the most impeccable way. She didn't put a step wrong. And if you consider how young she came to the throne, such a tender age, and how many prime ministers she's seen from Winston Churchill on. And she was very much guided by Winston Churchill to begin with. So again, all of that sort of upbringing stood her in good stead. So when it came time for a Commonwealth tour, she wasn't even queen at the time, she was just princess. When you go on these Commonwealth tours, it is a sort of companion, but it's more than that. You need someone who, when you haven't come into the reception yet, is there in your place. Someone who can identify the hierarchy of every person in the room, which ambassador to which country, the name of the official, the governor general, whoever it might be. And so your lady in waiting is there in your role, hosting until the sovereign arrives. When you're doing a tour of duty or inspecting a guard of honor, your lady in waiting is there literally in your shadow, 2 steps behind, to take the bouquets, to be there with the handbag for anything that she might need. It's not an assistant by no means. And it's certainly not a role a husband would ever play. So it's a very unique role and really only one that a sovereign would need. And so my mother travelled on 2 Commonwealth tours because the first one, when they left, nobody knew. Nobody had any idea how ill the king was. And he died very, very young, 56. And she would never have left. She adored her father, very close to him. And they always referred to themselves as we four, Margaret, Elizabeth, her mother and father. She would never have left England if she had had any inkling. But it is extraordinary to think that my mother now is the only living person who was with the Queen the moment she became Queen, not at the coronation, but actually at that moment. And they were in Kenya, and they had done quite a few weeks of work already, and they were given by the Kenyan government the treetops as a wedding present, where they were able to take a couple of days off duty, where they could go and watch the wildlife. And she went up that ladder to treetops, to that platform, to look at the wildlife, very famously as a princess. And while she was up there back in England, the king dies and she comes down that ladder as a queen. Of course, they were really the last people in the world to hear about his death. They couldn't get the message through because they were in such a remote part of Kenya. When the message did come through, the Queen realised obviously she needed at once to return to England. And my mother distinctly remembers that immediately the Queen didn't think of herself, her grief, the horror, the shock of losing her father without her being there beside him. But she immediately thought of the party she was with, the entourage, and she said, "I am so sorry, but we are going to have to go back to England." And I think my mother always says those words really struck with her, "I am so sorry." The extraordinary part of this story is when they went back through from treetops to Nairobi, the world's press had had a chance to descend on the airport to see the Queen now return to England. And her private secretary said to the awaiting crowds, as a sign of respect for Princess Elizabeth, "Please don't take a picture of her." And no one did. All the press put their cameras on the floor. Imagine today anybody being able to do that. And so there's not one picture of the Queen leaving Kenya.
I'd love to hear about your process as an editor and a curator going through your mother's ephemera, she was quite a collector, to try to piece this book together. I mean, how long did it take you? How much participation did you have from her? And frankly, how much help did you have?
Interesting question. It's taken me 2 years, 2 damn long years to do this book. I tell you why, because we started, Penguin Random House came to us and said, we'd love to do it. But my mum and I did a documentary in England, which was, I think, called My Years with the Queen. And I was sort of hosting this show. And after that, I think Penguin Random House thought this is interesting. And so they said, would you do a book on My Years with the Queen? And we started on that. My mum said, and I said, don't worry, Mum, I'll do it all. I'll do it all. You can just do the final edit and with the big red pen go through everything. But of course, inevitably, the publishers wanted more and more and more insider information, inside detail on the sort of workings of a royal household and the Queen herself. And really, my mum felt she didn't actually want to give that. She didn't want to do that book. So rather desperately, the advance was handed back. But because we had started the process, I realized that actually opening up my mum's what we call a muniment room, but actually it's an archive, I suddenly discovered so many beautiful things like invitations and royal programs and letters from the Queen and all sorts of extraordinary things that had never been seen, never been publicized, obviously. And I said to my mum, I think there is a place in history for this. And I think this is an important thing for people to see. It is a disappearing era. It's a disappearing world. And rightly or wrongly, it was there. But I think that from this book now, and I hope it is a beautiful book to look at, and I hope it's a beautiful book to read, I think I was able to tell my mum's story. And it was much easier for me to say it because she would never do it. She would never do me, as we said at the beginning. She would never write in the first person. And I really wanted to make sure I got it. I knew this was the only time we were going to do this. There won't be more. And there was so much to get in because obviously there's all those amazing years of a very unusual childhood. And then all the extraordinary things of literally a front row seat at historical events. Who do we know today has sat with Mahatma Gandhi? She sat beside him at his prayer meetings. She witnessed the power of how he could control a crowd, and all of that. So it is all remarkable. But also, I think, and I keep sort of saying lessons that can be learned. I think duty, service, loyalty and family, endurance. I think that there is also the sense of history, a quiet wisdom. And she's been through a lot herself. Her father was murdered by the IRA. We were all there on holiday. She was the only adult standing left amongst the shatters of political assassination. I was 11 years old. I had no idea what those words even meant. It destroyed our family for a while. And yet her sister, my aunt, and my mother very much decided they were not going to live a life of grief and bitterness. They were going to move forward. And I think that there's something so worthwhile in thinking about that and really taking that as an example to all of us. She is now, I think, the oldest, in fact, I know she's the oldest direct descendant of Queen Victoria. And it's funny because sometimes we go out to the movies together and we're waiting in line for our ice cream. And I always think, wow, Mum, you're just a living piece of history. That's just amazing. But she's a very funny, very forward-thinking piece of history.
Well, India, thank you so much, not only for telling us about her, but for memorializing her in this really powerful and thoroughly enjoyable way and thoroughly beautiful way. So it's a fabulous book. We recommend everybody get it. And the book is called Lady Pamela, My Mother's Extraordinary Years as Daughter to the Viceroy of India, Lady in Waiting to the Queen, and Wife of David Hicks. It's a great gift, by the way. Everyone's going to love it, especially us. So thank you again for joining us. And give your mother our best. We hope to see her at the theater this fall.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, India. Take care.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. AirMail's Arts Intel Report. Our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
It is the weekend. I know you have one way to pass the time for us. Please do share. Don't hold back.
Sure. Well, first, I'm excited. This is for next year, but I'm telling you to do this now because I think tickets are going on sale this weekend, which is the great band Oasis is reuniting after 15 years of Noel and Liam Gallagher sort of feuding. So I think it's going to be one of the great concerts of next year. I'd urge you to buy your tickets, and it's probably going to be an unforgettable champagne supernova of a tour. Then, what better way to pass the end of summer than you've got the U.S. Open, Ashley? I know you're a big fan. I'm excited about it. Perfect way to end your summer with even the balls are that perfect shade of brat green, maybe. And then I finally just one more thing. If you do want to stay inside and watch some TV, season 4 of Only Murders in the Building has just launched, which has got a great plot line. Martin Short, Steve Martin, and Selena Gomez find themselves in Hollywood, of all places, because someone wants to turn their podcast into, what else? A movie, looking for content. So it's very funny, boasts loads of cameos, and it's streaming on Hulu now. And you, my dear, what can you recommend for us?
Well, I have been reading this really interesting and kind of bizarre new book called Raising Hair by Chloe Dalton. Chloe Dalton this is her first book. She's been a political advisor and a speechwriter in the UK. In fact, she's been the writing partner to Angelina Jolie, Michael, your favorite. But during lockdown, she was out in the English countryside and she came, this sounds ridiculous. She came upon a leveret, which is a baby hare, and ended up raising this creature during lockdown and wrote a memoir about it. And it's just incredibly well written. It's beautifully done. It sort of combines like the history of the hare with her first-person experience raising one of these from a newborn. And it's just incredibly enjoyable and really charming, and a great reminder that we should really be using our powers of observation much more in the natural world because of the many delights that it can thrust upon us. So it's called Raising Hair by Chloe Dalton. It's already out in the UK and it's coming out in the US on September 26th. So you can pre-order it now on Amazon.
Sounds great.
Yeah, it's a good one. Well, we wish you all a fabulous weekend, a long one. Michael, will you please read us out?
Yeah, enjoy the long weekend. The Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan. And our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly, but we will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thank you again for joining us.